Hello all, and welcome to the next video in my series on the classes of Vanguard Saga of Heroes. Today I will be covering the Paladin class, and continuing going from the tanks first and going on down the list. If you have seen my class overview video that I put out a little while ago, actually quite a while ago now, not putting these out at quite the rate I was hoping, but if you have seen my class overview video, where I went briefly over the Paladin class, I described it as kind of the most defensive of the three tanks, focused more on support and not so much on offensive capabilities. For the most part, that is true. It's pretty accurate. As you'll see later on in this video, there are kind of exceptions, but overall, the theme of the Paladin is pretty defensive and supportish, I guess. The Paladin Vanguard does pretty much conform to the standard fantasy Paladin stereotype, if you will. It is the same kind of holy warrior that you kind of expect, but done in a really cool way, I think. Unlike the Dread Knight, which is definitely the most caster-like of the tanks, it's got a bunch of spells, as well as melee attacks, life taps, damage over time, debuffs it can put on monsters, and things like that. Or the warrior, who is kind of the opposite and is it's just basically martial and melee attacks only, and no spells whatsoever. The Paladin is kind of in between. A Paladin does have spells, but they aren't really offensive in nature like the Dread Knights. They're more kind of support spells. Paladin actually has heals, which it can use. The Dread Knight can heal itself through life tapping, but it can't heal anyone else. The Paladin actually has heals that it can use, and various support abilities like that. And whereas the Dread Knight really has no buffs to speak of, but it can debuff mobs, the Paladin is kind of the reverse. Paladins have lots of buffs for themselves and their groups, but they don't really debuff a monster they're fighting very much. They do have some, but not a lot. So yeah, having said that, let me introduce my Paladin here. My Dread Knight that I used in my Dread Knight video was level 32. My Paladin here is level 28, so not quite so high. 28, right about halfway up the level range. But this is kind of high enough to show you the basic gist of the Paladin class. This is where I really kind of start to get some of the abilities that make the Paladin what it is. And then later on I'll be able to show you something special, because I have the ability to show you a bit higher level and a Paladin at its full capability. But for now, I'm just going to kind of run through real quickly the abilities the Paladin gets and kind of how it works. So where the Dread Knight, as I mentioned, it doesn't really have any buffs per se. A Paladin does. It's not necessarily one of the best buff classes in the game, but it does have a few buffs. I have those over here on the left side. Courage, it's just a kind of a basic hit point, an armor class buff for whoever you cast it on in their group. Pretty straightforward. It's a nice little buff, and they can either buff strength or armor class and resistances, etc. And they have a cool ability called Gift of Peace, which you can put on other players, and that reduces the aggression they generate, which helps you hold aggro. Pretty cool. Only works on melee though. And that's all I have on this Paladin so far. You do get some more later on, but as far as buffs go, I have my heals kind of here on the top row. Laying on of hands. If you've played EverQuest, this was the the signature ability of the Paladins, Lay on Hands. Here, it's not quite such a long reuse, but it is pretty much the same effect. But it does cost virtue points to use, which is something I will explain here in a minute. But basically, Paladins get a third resource pool that they can use, unlike most classes. They're actually the only class that uses virtue. But then they also have a regular, standard cast heal, which costs energy, which I can just like that, and it'll heal me. Not that I needed it at the moment. And then they also have an instant cast group heal, which you can use, and they get another one later on. They also get the ability to res people much later out of combat. As far as offensive spells go, they don't really have much. They have Smite, which it has a really long range, and it doesn't really do hardly any damage, and it adds a little bit of hate. It's kind of a pulling tool, really, is what it is. Dictum of Valis is a bigger nuke, but it costs virtue, which comes in a limited supply. And then you can put judgments on a mob, but you can only have one judgment active at any time on the same monster. So you kind of have to pick which one you want to use. Like this one is small damage over time. This one's kind of for dealing with adds almost, where it reduces their accuracy and movement by 70% until you hit it. So that's really what that's kind of for. This one, Judgment of the Bloodthirsty, makes the monster take damage whenever it attacks. And then Judgment of the Proud, which is really the Paladin's only real debuff, reduces strength by an amount, which reduces the melee damage that a monster does. And that's really all they have in the way of spells. Like I said, the DK has a lot more offensive spells. The Paladin array of spells is much more defensive and support in nature, kind of as you'd expect a Paladin to be. But offensively, a Paladin, therefore, is pretty much all melee. Here we have a couple, shield attacks they can use. They can shield bash, since a Paladin does use a one-hander and a shield pretty much all the time. That's their wield style, with the kind of exception of later on when you get up to max level and you get your epic weapons. Paladins do have an option to use a two-hander, but that's kind of later on. If you're planning on playing a Paladin, you'll be going sword and board pretty much your entire career there. And yeah, they kind of have a range of melee attacks here. Paladins, again, as you might expect, do have an advantage against undead and fiendish targets. Again, sort of keeping with the lore of a Paladin. They even have a chain here, which is specifically only affects undead and fiendish targets, but it really, really hurts when you're able to use it. So yeah, that's kind of the basic idea. In keeping with, I'll start fighting here in a minute, but in keeping with the idea of the group support-ish role while they're fulfilling the tank role, a lot of their abilities have extra benefits to their group. Like they have two chains here. This one they can use increases the Paladin's own block chance by 14 and the armor class of your group for 5 minutes. This one increases the strength of you and your group for 5 minutes. This attack also increases the strength. Actually, this one's self-only, but increases your own strength. And this one increases your armor class. So you have an ability. The two chains increase the strength and ability of you and your group for 5 minutes. These two increase the strength and AC of yourself for 5 minutes. And even the stances of the Paladin, or here Aura of Replenishment, which increases regeneration for the group, as well as making your own spellcasting a little more potent for healing and such. Your defensive stance, which not only does the standard mitigation and hate increase, but grants armor class to your group. And your offensive stance, which increases both your and your group's damage by 10 and accuracy by 8. So basically, a lot of the things a Paladin can do will benefit the group that you're in, which makes them really nice for grouping, being group tanks. Really the only downside of the Paladin is that they don't have the ability to perform any AoE attacks. Their AoE hate generation is very poor. compared to the other. Like a warrior is really the king of AoE aggro because of their ability set. A paladin has pretty much none. None of these abilities you see on my bar right now, on my hot bars right now, are AoE. And I think they get one AoE force target, and that's really about it. So a paladin is really about, when I say they're really defensive and supportish, not only in their abilities that affect the group and everything, but they really focus on grabbing one mob and holding it really, really well. And then, being able to, they have a lot of tools for support and healing. They have an invuln here, which surrounds you and your allies with an invuln for 4 seconds. So it's not only an invuln for yourself, it affects your group as well. That's pretty awesome. But anyway, so yeah, I'll start fighting here in case anyone's getting impatient. But they can solo pretty well, a paladin can, because unlike the warrior, it can heal itself. I'm going to debuff this guy with Judgment of Crowd, and then get to it. But a paladin can solo pretty well because unlike the warrior, it can heal itself. A warrior has no way of healing itself. A DK can life tap. Let me throw up my buffs here. Increase, more strength, more AC. A DK can life tap. A paladin can just heal itself, which makes it solo, decent soloing. In general, like I said, when a paladin is more defensive in nature, it's going to tend to put out less damage than a DK or a warrior, just by nature of the class and its abilities. But that said, a paladin does have a unique advantage in the DPS damage dealing realm in that it can burst damage really hard. It may not be quite so evident at lower levels, but the higher level you get, the better a paladin is at really doing big spike damage. And the reason for this is their virtue abilities. The paladin has, like I mentioned before, a third resource, which is you have your endurance and your energy here. But this, on my UI, I forget what it looks like on the default UI. Here it's this number 12. This means I have 12 virtue points available to me right now. And I can use those virtue points to cast abilities that cost virtue. Like Laying On of Hands here is a big heal, and it's an instant cast. If you use it on anyone that is not if you use it on yourself or any other paladin, it costs you 3 virtue points. If you use it on someone who's not a paladin, it's free, which is pretty cool, frankly. But if you use it on yourself, like when you're soloing, it will cost you 3 virtue. And then this invuln here costs 2 virtue. And then these abilities here are very potent offensive abilities, but Marshalling Cry doesn't. It's kind of nice. But the big ones here, Zeal and Paragon of Justice, cost virtue points. Zeal costs 3 and Paragon of Justice costs 6. So, and you only have a limited virtue pool. So you need to be mindful of how much virtue you're using because you don't want to run out. And it doesn't regenerate that quickly. You get 1 virtue point back every couple of minutes or something like that. But like I said, in those spike damage situations where you really need to grab aggro or do a burn, you can pop Zeal, which makes all your attacks strike twice, and cuts your endurance costs in half. And I forget the exact duration of it, but it's like 20 seconds or something pretty long. This is basically a double damage ability, while cutting your endurance costs in half, which lets you spam your attacks for double damage, for 3 virtue points and a refresh of 3 minutes. It's pretty nice. And on top of that, Paragon of Justice, increases your strength, dex, con, and vitality, gives you 60% additional accuracy and 30% additional damage for like 30 seconds or something like that. So when you use your virtue abilities, you can really bump up your offensive power by quite a bit. the reason people say the Paladin really doesn't do that much DPS is because they usually don't use these abilities because they don't want to run themselves out of virtue, because then, you know, if they run themselves out of virtue, they can't use their invulns if they need to, and things like that. So a Paladin's not going to really burn all their virtue on every mob because they can't, because it just doesn't, they can't generate virtue that quickly, which is why most of the time a Paladin will be the lowest on the offensive ability scale for the tanks and the most defensive. But on those occasions where they do pop up all their virtue abilities, they can do some real respectable damage. So let me this one is a 4-dot, unlike the one I killed a couple minutes ago, which was pretty easy, frankly, because I was much higher level and it was pretty easy for me. This one is going to be a much bigger challenge, but partway through I'll pop some of my virtue stuff and you'll see the difference. So basically, here we go. He's probably going to out-damage me. He's going to do more damage to me than I am of him, is my guess, unless I keep blocking everything, which is cool at the moment. I'm blocking a ton. Like every attack. Look at this, 4 in a row. Well, I may not have to use my my virtue stuff, but anyway, you'll see the speed at which I kill it gets a lot faster. Okay, he's starting to do some damage to me now. But I'm gonna get some of my endurance back. So I've been hitting him. I'm hitting him for not a whole lot. I'm blocking a lot, which is really nice. I'm gonna switch over into my Aura of Replenishment stance and heal myself real quickly. Back up. So I got him down to about 60. And then, assuming I don't miss too much, which hopefully will be nice, I'm gonna pop into my offensive stance, open up a crit, pop Marshalling Cry, Zeal, and Paragon of Justice, and let's see how hard I hit him. Look at that, 2,000 damage per hit. Really, really beating him up like that. So, yeah, using your virtue makes fights much, much easier, but see, now I'm down to 3 virtue points. So I can't do that again, well, not only because of the refresh on the abilities, but I don't have enough virtue to do that again for a while. So most of the time, a Paladin is the least offensive of the tanks, but if you can virtue burn, then they can put out some good damage. The other tanks are just more offensive at all times, so that's where that idea comes from. And overall, a warrior is still pretty much always going to outparse a paladin on a DPS parse, like if you're in a raid or something at endgame. Overall, a warrior will pretty much always outburn a paladin. The only exception being on a very short fight, where a paladin pops up his virtue burn, basically. At that point, if the fight is short enough, a paladin will output more damage than the warrior or the dread knight will. But then once all these abilities wear off, their DPS will drop back down, and then the other classes will catch up. But so basically what that means for on the level up, again, the virtue burn is pretty nice, but you won't be able to use it all the time. So a paladin will still be pretty... they're very tanky, of course, because of all their support abilities and everything. But they really are not so good in AoE situations, and they're not the highest DPS tanks most of the time. Let me put on all my combat buffs again. I have endurance to do so. Again, these are just short duration combat buffs which increase strength and AC. There, I got them all up. Reactions. I'm still in replenishment stance. Let me heal myself up real quickly. Switch back into offensive and beat this monster up. This one's only a level 25 3-dot, so he's pretty easy for me since I'm level 28. just to go over these chains real quickly, like the DK, this is a DPS chain, 400% weapon damage DPS chain, which the DK also has. This is the hate chain for the Paladin, except unlike the DK or the Warrior, the hate chain on a Paladin is actually 300% weapon damage, you can see in the tooltip, as well as hate over time. So actually for a Paladin, in a grouping situation where you're trying to hold aggro, on the DK or the Warrior, most of the time it's actually better aggro generation to use the DPS chain in most situations. But on the Paladin, I'm not a pro Paladin in any shape or form, but you can actually use the hate chain because it will do really decent damage in addition to doing the hate over. Ooh, I just pulled 3 on myself. This is going to be fun. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to Judgment of the Envious, that guy. Judgment of the Proud, this guy. And go to town here. See what I can do. I have my Zeal back up if I need it, but these guys are pretty easy. They're only level 24, so I should be able to take all 3 of these. Yeah. Judgment of the Envious on you. Okay. Take care of the other guy. Judgment of the Impure for the extra dot damage. Use my DPS chain. Kind of running out. I'm going to let my endurance regen a little bit here so that I can use my melee attack. So I'm going to take a quick break to heal myself up. This is why a Paladin is much better soloer than a Warrior for sure. Alright, now that's done. So I'm going to kill this guy, finish this guy off, and then we'll take on the last one. Throw a Judgment of the Impure for a small dot. And just beat him down. Okay, so, well, that was fun. But anyway, yeah, for the hate chain versus the DPS chain, in a group situation where you really want to hold aggro on a mob, it's actually not a bad idea to use the hate chain on a Paladin, as opposed to a DK and a Warrior, where usually the DPS chain will generate more aggro. And it may sort of be the case here too, because it's 400% weapon damage, but 300% weapon damage is pretty good in itself, and you get the extra hate, so not a bad idea. But this does have a refresh at 30 seconds, so get my loot. Okay, well, I guess that's pretty good for now. I do have a special treat though. I will be right back on a different Paladin who is max level and quite well geared, and I will be able to show you a little bit of what a high level Paladin looks like. Alright, so here I am on a maximum level Paladin who is very well geared. The particular armor that this Paladin is wearing is a little bit over the top, I think, in my opinion. It would be really good if the armor itself is really awesome, if only the shoulder pads weren't quite so big. It's kind of my one complaint. It's the most sort of silly looking armor just because of the shoulders in this game. But for the most part, all the armor models in this game are really realistic, and I like them a lot. And even this isn't terrible. But this is basically the end game gear for Paladin, and for most of the tanks, or everybody in the game really is Pota gear is the end game stuff. And then on his back, you'll see this Paladin's actually wearing a two-hander instead of a sword and a shield. And the reason for that is that this is actually the Paladin two-handed epic weapon. It is the one exception to Paladins wearing a sword and a shield, because it's actually coded to be a two-hander but still allow you to use attacks that require a shield. It's kind of both in a two-hander. It does have it's not quite as defensive as using an actual shield. It doesn't give you as much block chance and as much defensive ability as using an actual shield. But unlike if you were to use a two-hander while you were leveling up, you still can use your shield attacks with it, which is it's a neat little perk of using the two-handed epic. It'll net you a little bit more damage by using it instead of the one-hander and shield epics, but you will lose a little bit of defensive capability. So depending on the situation, you might want to stick with the one-hander and the shield if you really want to worry about your mitigation and taking a lot of damage really well. But sometimes we know when this situation's not quite such a big deal, it can be fun to throw on the two-hander and try to pump out some more damage. But anyway, yeah, so you'll see a few more abilities on the bars than on the other Paladin. Most of them will still be the same. All the melee attacks are still pretty much the same. I mean, these are the upgraded versions, obviously, but they're still there. Here's the one extra virtue heal that the other Paladin wasn't high enough for yet. Group heal over time, which costs virtue points. Couple extra judgments. It's like a lull judgment and something like that. And then the other Paladin had one invuln. Paladins actually get 3 invulns. This is the one that the other Paladin had, Shield of Glory, and they also get Barrier of Faith here, which is a 5-second immunity for the Paladin and their defensive target. So that's 10 seconds of total invuln time, plus Final Stand, which costs 6 virtue, and this is the big one. This is an 8-second. So that's 18 seconds worth of invuln time. And this one actually increases damage by 25 per second for 8 seconds, which is really nice as well. So when I was saying that Paladins are really more defensive, this is kind of the reason why. They have all this invuln time. They can use it to invuln people in their other people and their group and themselves for a lot more compared to the other tanks. Dread Knights, like I mentioned in my Dread Knight video, they do get a 10-second invuln, but they only have 1. Paladins have 3. For a significant more amount of time and for more people than just themselves. Combine abilities like this with their healing abilities and their buffs and such, and that's really why they're the defensive / support style tank. And most of their stuff really helps out their group members and other people. And the warrior has 0 invulns, so they're really kind of the opposite end of the spectrum and completely offensive. And then the only other really thing on this Paladin that the other Paladin didn't have at all is the shield consecrations, which the Paladin starts getting in the second half of the level range. And what these are is a Paladin can kind of consecrate their shield to have an effect. So whenever you get hit or use a shield attack, there is a chance for you to proc an effect. Like Shield of Resolve here gives you a chance to restore endurance to your group whenever you get hit or use a shield attack, which can be really nice because melee classes and endurance using classes can really burn through endurance pretty quickly if they don't have endurance regen buffs. So this can really, Shield of Resolve can really help, and that's a big one. You get it at level 38. Shield of Chastening lets the Paladin generate additional aggression, additional hate on a mob. Shield of Solace provides healing to your group, and then Shield of Rebuke can have a chance of stunning the mob you're hitting. So those are really the big things that the other Paladin didn't have at all, as well as the additional invulns. So the Paladins really do have a lot of tools to use that are really support in nature. While they're beating the crap out of the mob with all their melee attacks and everything, and all their virtue burn abilities, and Blood Oath is another one thing that they get later, where as long as you don't change your target, then you have additional melee damage and accuracy for 5 minutes, just by casting it on a mob that you're fighting. So Paladins are really built to grab a single mob, like a raid boss, for example, and just tank it. Do a lot of damage to that one target, with all their extra damage abilities, Marshalling Cry, Blood Oath, Virtue Burn if they need to. They can Virtue Burn right off the bat on a fight and generate a significant aggro lead over everyone else. And then, you know, the raid can just go to town. And then with all their invulns, if they need it, and their group heals and everything like that, they make a really good tank. Again, none of this stuff is AoE. The one ability they have that's an AoE is Shining Beacon here, which it's a AoE Force Taunt, which costs Virtue. And while that can be used, it's that they're not going to hold AoE aggro as a Paladin, really. It's very difficult to do so. If they're going to do so by any means, it's probably going to be heal aggro more than melee aggro, unless they're constantly switching targets and applying hate generation to each mob in turn. So hopefully that gives you guys a better look at the Paladin class. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. I'm try to be pretty good about answering any questions and or fixing anything that I need to fix in future videos if you have any constructive criticism for me. And the next video should be on the warrior class, which is actually my main class, so that will be the one I know the most about. And hopefully I'll be able to get that one out soon. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.